Good evening and welcome back to ParaGhoul Paranormal, Discoveries from the Dark. The radio show where we dive into the shadows of Saskatchewan and sometimes even across Canada like tonight to see what lies within. I'm your host, K.D. Kulpa, and I'm a horror author and paranormal researcher based here in Regina. And today we're going to head to Eastern Canada. So as I said, sometimes we're going to go across Canada to find some mysteries and find some urban legends to talk about. And that's what we're doing tonight. And this is an old mystery, kind of from the early 1900s, that I thought was interesting when I learned about it. And imagine spending a quiet day fishing only to discover a coffin floating up onto the beach nearby. A coffin that had been missing for 8 years. Like many urban legends and mysteries, this one all started with a disappearance and the following search that would go on for so many years that it would later become a story that would explode beyond proportion. However, the actual story is just as fascinating as the legend. So this particular urban legend came up in a search, again, for Canadian legends and mysteries, just like the Wendigo in Fort Kent did. And just like the Wendigo in Fort Kent, the true story that actually comes up when you're willing to dig into, historical newspaper articles and the archives goes a little different than what the legend claims. But first, let me tell you about the mystery of Charles Coghlan's coffin. So Charles Coghlan was an actor back in the 1800s. Although there are some articles indicating that he was Canadian, the truth is that he was actually born in France back on June 11th, 1842. His father was originally from Dublin, Ireland, and his mother had been born on one of the islands of the English Channel. So Irish and English born, essentially, even though he was born in France. Apparently, Charles had been actually groomed to take on a profession in law. So his family wanted him to become a lawyer, but his heart was set on a completely different lifestyle, and that was in theater. So not only did he love to act, but apparently he also loved to write, and he would become a decent playwright for, the day. Throughout his career, he would go on to write and adapt many plays, as well as be kind of the lead actor in some of them. He would travel all over the world, including to Prince Edward Island here in Canada. So the story goes that he fell in love with the small town Fortune Bridge in Prince Edward Island, where an actors' colony had developed, known as the Fortune Bay Colony. In fact, one source that I found that was written back in 1981 stated that Charles was actually the one to start the colony himself. And while there, he was writing plays that would later be shown on tour around the United States and into Canada. He had even gone so far as to buy a small farm in the area. Well, I guess he loaned money from somebody to buy the farm, which he would later never be able to pay back. But he did have an address in Prince Edward Island. But unfortunately for him, he had to travel down to the United States with his company for one of his plays. And while there, he ended up getting ill and would never see Fortune Bridge again, or the Bay Fortune, which is the nearby water area. Supposedly, before he even left Fortune Bridge to go down, he had claimed he would be returning home no matter what. But perhaps this is when the mystery really began, because there's so much kind of hearsay around this time, so it's hard to say for sure what was actually said, what's actually true. But what we do know is that he did go down and stay in Galveston, Texas, which is where his play company was doing one of his new plays, The Royal Box. And he was supposed to actually be acting in the play. He was supposed to be doing, I think it was the main role he was supposed to be doing. But because he had become so ill before he could take to the stage, a backup actor took his place, and it ended up being the only one to do it, as Charles never could act again. Unfortunately for him, he was ill for a full month and unable to travel or act. And on November 27th, 1899, actor and playwright Charles Francis Coghlan did die from his illness. I was able to find a newspaper article in the Daily Sun from St. John, New Brunswick that confirmed that this happened on November 28th. So they wrote about it the next day. And it had quoted one from Galveston, Texas, stating that the 56-year-old actor and author had died of gastritis. The article went on to say that his remains were being prepared to ship immediately to his former summer home in Prince Edward Island. So he wanted to go home. However, for him, this is unfortunately not where the story ends. It seems that Charles would have to wait in his coffin for a really long time to finally be transported. And in late September in 1900, so almost a full year later, a storm would hit Galveston, leading to the Colorado River swelling and taking up bridges, destroying livestock and railways. And as it would happen, it would even take numerous coffins and dead bodies within its surge. Apparently the water, when it was, swelling and going through the town, the water had actually hit some of the vaults for the cemeteries, which were full of caskets waiting for, being delivered to their final rest. And included in those caskets that would be taken was that of Charles Coghlan, where he was waiting for the final orders from the family of where he would be sent. Now, of course, this is where some of the different stories that I found, they had kind of different explanations for why his body was sitting there and waiting, but one of them was that there was some disagreement. So originally his body was supposed to be sent to Prince Edward Island in the casket, but then I guess later on, I don't know if it was his sister or his daughter, would decide that actually they wanted it to go to New York to be cremated. But for whatever reason, I don't know if there was arguments or if, I don't know. I don't know whatever happened. I couldn't find any information on what actually happened, but he ended up sitting there in his coffin for almost a full year, only to be swept by the water and disappear. So I can only imagine what was left of him after sitting in a casket for almost a year. But now on top of that, his body is swept away by a large amount of water. Right away, of course, a search party started because not only were they trying to find his body and casket, but they were trying to find the others that had been swept away, as well as, find out if there were any casualties. And so, of course, there's a big search party going on and trying to find where all the damage was. But unfortunately for Charles, his casket would take much longer than expected to be found. In fact, according to the Chickasha Daily Express on January 22nd, 1901, the search for his casket in particular had been abandoned. Apparently, after months of searching, they couldn't determine where his casket, among some others that were still missing, they had no idea where it could be located. And at that time, they decided that his casket must have been swept off to the sea. This is likely the best place to talk about the legend, which is kind of said to be what happens next. And so the story goes that the casket was found washed up on Bay Fortune by a group of Prince Edward Island fishermen. So the legend claims that a casket with a metal plate bearing the name of Charles Coghlan had found its way home and had washed up on the beach. The legend goes on to say that at some point after his casket, so before it was found but after it was lost, during that storm in Galveston, a fortune teller had even made a claim that his body was going to be found when it returned home. So now you can find many stories about the supposed occurrence. Some claim that Charles was even born in Prince Edward Island and that he had been baptized in Prince Edward Island, but that wasn't actually the case from what I could find. There was nothing stating that he had ever been baptized there. He was just, part of this actors colony. That's all I could find about him in Prince Edward Island. However, there have since been many that claim it took, full 8 years for this casket to make its way through the water, through the sea, to eventually find its final resting place in its favorite summer hometown. So, it's kind of a fun little ghost story / legend that his ghost must have really wanted him to make it back to Prince Edward Island. And so it was going through anything it could to get there. But what actually happened? Okay, so first, let me go back to the day that Charles died. I'll read you some of kind of the pieces from the actual article that were recorded, his death in that St. John's Daily Sun from New Brunswick that I told you about. So let's kind of go back to that first. Okay, so the article goes on to say, the death of well-known actor and dramatist. His remains will be taken to his former summer home in Prince Edward Island for interment. Charles Coghlan, the actor and author, died here today of gastritis, aged 56 years. He had been ill in Galveston since his theatrical engagement here 4 weeks ago. His wife was at his bedside when the end came and is prostrated with grief. The remains will be shipped immediately to Prince Edward Island, Mr. Coghlan's former summer home. Mr. Coghlan arrived here on October 30th with the Royal Box Company, but did not appear owing to his illness. Physicians were summoned, and it was afterwards announced that the actor was suffering from acute gastritis. His condition remained unchanged until this morning, when a violent change for the worse occurred, followed shortly by death. And then it goes on to talk about how he was born in France, of English and Irish parents. And although he was educated for the bar, he never followed that profession and instead became an actor as a young man. So what I found interesting about the article is they go on to talk about his sister, actually, who apparently was a well-known actress in America at the time. So it goes on to talk a lot about her. And then the final kind of paragraph of the article talks about some other drama that Charles got into. So obviously Charles liked his drama because he was an actor and he was in theater, but he also liked his drama at home because it goes on to talk about Charles Coghlan was an actor of parts as well as a fairly gifted playwright, but in his later years did not realize the expectations of his earlier admirers. He achieved notoriety in 1893 by his alleged marriage, although he had then a wife and one daughter 21 years of age, to Miss Beveridge, granddaughter of ex-Governor Beveridge of Illinois, a girl of 19, renowned for her beauty, who had adopted the stage as a profession and had made her debut the previous January. The pair tried for a time to face down public indignation, but the presence of Mrs. Coghlan, number 1, and daughter in Chicago, raised such a storm that Miss Beveridge returned to her grandfather's arms, and Charles Coghlan sought refuge with his forgiving wife in their quiet country home in Prince Edward Island. So, yeah, he had some drama, which I find interesting that he would end up trying to marry someone younger than his daughter back then. But so that is that kind of, article from that day. And as I've mentioned previously, his body would then sit in the vault after he passed, waiting for the final decision of where he would be transported for almost a year, only to be lost to the water that swept through Galveston. So on January 21st, 1904, an actual metallic casket was found 18 miles away, and it was thought to be that of Charles Coghlan. So this is, 5 years later. The Meriden Daily Journal reported on it. So I'll just quickly read you what the very short article said on that day. And that was this: found metallic casket, believed to be that of actor Charles Coghlan. A metallic casket reported to have been found on the mainland 18 miles from this city is believed to be the box containing the body of Charles Coghlan, the actor, who died suddenly in Galveston in November 1899. The casket was washed out of the vault in the cemetery here by the terrible storm of September 8, 1900, and has been missing ever since. It was the intention to ship the body to New York. So see, there's some different kind of stories about where it was supposed to end up. J.C. Nixon, a hunter, found the casket yesterday in an unfrequented spot, which he was beating up for game. However, we would later find out that actually was not Charles. It turned out to be a body of a New York man instead. So again, the family had to return to being unable to find the body of Charles, likely giving even more ammo to spectators claiming that maybe he was returning to Prince Edward Island instead, or, simply lost at sea. However, January 15th, 1907 rolls around. Now we're almost 8 years later, and 7 years after his body's disappearance. They seem to have found a metal casket again. And this time it is Spokane Evening Chronicle that actually talks about it. And it says, lone coffin in marsh. A dispatch to the Tribune from Galveston, Texas says, the body of Charles Coghlan, the playwright and actor, which has been lost since the storm of September 8th, 1900, has been found in its metal coffin on the mainland in an out-of-the-way place. Hunters came on the coffin almost buried in a marsh, hidden by weeds. It had been lifted by the floods and carried 9 miles from the cemetery. So it actually only went 9 miles, not hundreds of miles, to return to Prince Edward Island. To this day, if you look up the location of Charles Coghlan's remains, there is supposedly a gravesite for him at the Lakeview Cemetery in Galveston, Texas. I couldn't actually find a picture of his headstone or an article stating that, if he had a proper burial or whatever happened with his coffin after it was found. But I imagine after being lost for so long, the family had likely grieved and moved on. And I can only imagine the state of his body was when they finally did find it. So it probably wasn't, a whole lot to cremate at that time. And perhaps the group that finally found him decided it was time to lay him to rest, no matter what the family said. But it's hard to say for sure what went down. So I don't know about you, but I was really curious as to where did this legend come from? When I was doing, a good Google search, I couldn't really find anything that stated where it started. So I thought maybe originally that a casket had been found that came up on the beach, or maybe a body had been found and it had, because of the mystery where his coffin had disappeared, maybe somehow they thought maybe it could be him, and in the end it ended up not being, or something. Because, usually these urban legends and these mysteries, they have some ring of truth to it. There is a reason why they start, right? Or at least that's, usually what they find. But in this case, I couldn't find any indication of a mysterious body floating up Bay Fortune in any of the historical newspapers. And believe me, that would be, a story for a newspaper back then. So I couldn't even find any indication that the legend was actually something that was being told prior to maybe the 1950s. There's a lot of news articles that started talking about it in the 1950s, 1970s, but I couldn't find anything like the 1910s, 1920s. And so what actually happened between, his body being found in 1907 in Texas and the supposed legend that it was found in Prince Edward Island? This is what I wanted to know. So this is what I started to dig into a little bit further to try and, figure out where the heck this was coming from. And apparently the legend about Prince Edward Island being the final resting place came likely because of memoirs from fellow actors that had been friends of Charles Coghlan. So the first one that I could find that was mentioned is a memoir of Johnston Forbes Robertson. So the memoir was titled A Player Under Three Reigns and was published in, I believe, 1925. Apparently, Forbes Robinson was a performer himself, so he acted as well, just like Charles Coghlan. And in fact, I think he even stated somewhere that he also had been to Prince Edward Island, so it was another one of these people that had been in the actor colony. And I guess he decided he wanted to give some extra dramatic flair to the disappearance of Coghlan's coffin. So I couldn't find an actual copy of his memoir. I tried to do, the old Google search with it. You can find that it did exist, and you can find kind of pictures of the cover, but I can't find anything that actually shows me the inside. So I wasn't able to find the actual text where he talks about Charles Coghlan's coffin. But all of the articles that I've read about this that have mentioned this memoir did say that the appearance of his coffin showing up in Prince Edward Island, the home he had always wanted to return to, had been embellished within that memoir. And later, in another autobiography, so this time by Lily Langtry, called The Days I Knew, also published around 1925, was and even, some extra tidbits to the story. So Lily, I guess, decided she was also an actress, also a Charles friend. I don't know, maybe she also went to the actor colony, I'm not sure. But she added on to the story that a fortune teller had actually predicted Coghlan's death prior to him dying. And, that Charles had gone out and seen this fortune teller and she told him what was going to happen to him. So he knew it was coming. So The Days I Knew, I actually was able to find on Google Books, and I was actually able to get a section where she talks about Charles Coghlan. So here, I'll read you just the one little bit of paragraph that I found that kind of brings in this extra little piece to the story. He died and was buried at Galveston, Texas, but his remains were not allowed to rest in peace, for the tidal wave that later demolished that town invaded the cemetery and swept many of the coffins, including that of Charles Coghlan, out to sea, which singular happening to his remains was predicted for him by a crystal gazer while he was still a young man. So you can already see she obviously likes the dramatic because she uses a lot of drama in just those couple of sentences. So it seems that these two memoirs were actually the start of this Canadian urban legend in the 1920s. So almost 20 years after his body had actually been found in Galveston, and as far as we can tell, was buried there. And it really blew up, I believe, because Ripley's Believe It or Not later picked it up as well in 1929. So in that book that I did find, I found a, newer copy of it. So I don't know how much of it is from the original 1929 copy, but it claimed that the daughter of Charles Coghlan had spent 20 some years searching for her father's remains, only to come across a cartoon in a newspaper, and the cartoon was by Ripley, showing a coffin washing up on a beach. And that this cartoon caught her attention, and she instantly, reached out to the cartoonist to find out how he found his information. And it actually shows the little cartoon in the book. So like I said, it's a really simple drawing of a coffin washed up on a beach. And on the drawing itself, it says, Coghlan comes home. He died in 1899 and was buried in Galveston. When the tragic flood came, his coffin was washed out to sea, and the Gulf Stream carried him around Florida and up the coast to Prince Edward Island, 2,000 miles distant where he lived. Apparently later it was even changed to where he was born, and maybe that's where the whole idea of he was born in Prince Edward Island came from. But when asked where they got their information, it says in the book that they of course referred to the two memoirs by Charles's friends. So this is by Johnston and Lilly, their stories that they put into their memoirs. Only no one followed up to see whether these claims in their books were actually true. Now, that being said, if you go back into the 1920s, when they didn't have the internet and our lovely Google, it probably was really hard to find information like that, especially, since it would have been 1907 that they found the body, so it would have been archived. Although you think they could have reached out to family and found out what actually happened. But it just kind of goes to show, even when it's a memoir or a biography, you can't always believe everything that you read. There are embellishments. There are sometimes outright lies in these things. So there you have it. Now we know another case where a legend in Canada was born from embellished or even outright fake stories written by people, and how somehow got turned into a Canadian urban legend. As we dig into more of these Canadian urban legends and mysteries, just like the Fort Kent Wendigo, like we did the last time, I'm kind of starting to sense a theme. But maybe next time we'll actually find one that hasn't been figured out. You never know, right? Okay, so now for those of you interested in the paranormal, especially if you have always been interested in being part of a paranormal investigation, but don't know where to start, I thought I'd mention an upcoming paranormal event that I just kind of randomly came across, especially since it's not too far from Regina. It's actually in Weyburn. I managed to come across this event on Google, and I wish I found it earlier. But anyway, I thought I'd mention it here, that Canadian Paranormal Expeditions is leading a paranormal investigation event, so where you can actually buy tickets to go on an investigation. And it's going through the Heritage Village in Weyburn on September 7th. So if you're interested in going, you can check out the information on the Weyburn website. I wish I could be going, so if you do go, definitely let me know. Would love to hear, what the Heritage Village is like. I have never been. But as many of you know, I'm publishing my debut horror novel this month, so my schedule is already packed with events and I can't go to any more. So let me know if you do go. I'd love to hear about it. But thank you for joining us tonight. Don't forget, if you'd like to support the show, you can find me on most social media platforms under KDKULPA. I also have a Patreon for those that want behind the scenes information, extra content, and a chance to join a live Q&A with me every month. Next week, we have a guest coming on to join us. So for this guest episode, we have Josh, also known as You Say Whoa on TikTok. Josh has been involved in paranormal investigations in Saskatchewan, and more recently, he also has done a series he calls Scary Saskatchewan on TikTok, I should say. This is actually how I got to know Josh, is through his Scary Saskatchewan series, where he shares ghost stories from Saskatchewan. As some of you may know from my history, I used to do a haunted Saskatchewan one, so of course that's how we came across each other. So tune in to learn more about his experience on investigations here in Saskatchewan, what led him to get involved in the paranormal, and really who knows what else we'll get to talking about. I've chatted with him a few times before. I was on his podcast. I did an interview with him on my YouTube before, and we always end up chatting for a really long time. So don't be surprised if we have to cut our conversation in two again, because there's always more for us to talk about. So stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, where we'll uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and delve deeper into the shadows. Until then, remember to keep your flashlight handy and digital recorders ready. This is Katie Kulpa signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.